Grandmaster Aleksandra Goryachkina is entering in to the third round of the FIDE Candidates 2026. She's taking on Divya Deshmukh from India, and this is going to be an amazing clash as Divya enters in with her mother for the game. Both the players have had two draws in the first two rounds, and off we go. A handshake, and the clock begins. Pawn to e4 by Goryachkina. And Divya plays c5, Sicilian on the board. Divya likes to always play aggressive chess. Goryachkina is known for her technical, solid chess. She plays the Sicilian Rosolimo with bishop to b5 and g6 played. To put the bishop on the long diagonal, bishop takes c6. You can take both ways, d takes and b takes. Divya prefers to take b takes c6 towards the center. White castles here, and now bishop to g7 quickly played. Goryachkina brings her rook into the center, defending the pawn. Queen comes to c7, and now pawn to d3 played. You have pawn to d6. Maybe one of the ideas in this position is to put your pawn on e5, knight e7 and castles. But white pushes forward with pawn to e5. And Divya takes it. Well, d5 would have been a positional error, as that would have weakened the c5 tremendously. But knight to f6, and now the thing is that in such a structure, often white is better because black's pawns are weak and isolated, but what black is counting on are the bishop pair and just this fluid center that's moving. Castles. So I've seen Boris Gelfand take such positions and faced no problems in equalizing, but you have to play this very carefully. Now, queen e2, Divya goes f6. Not sure if this is the best move, but knight goes back, and now she wants to build a big center with e5. Okay, let's see how white reacts to this. Bishop e3 played by Goryachkina, attacking the pawn here. I think you need to defend it with queen e7, but bishop g4, Divya readily sacrificing the pawn here. And Goryachkina, well, she can take the pawn, but she says, well, I'll do that later. Let me first ask a question to the bishop on g4. And so Divya first takes bishop on e3, queen e3, attacking the pawn on c5. Bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and now rook a d8, getting the rook into the center of the board, and we have rook e2 played. Black plays pawn to h5, and white brings the rook into the center with rook e1. King h7. The bishop can pop out on this diagonal. And she goes h4. How interesting was the idea to play g4 actually. Takes, and then use the h file for yourself. Would have been quite exciting actually. But h4 makes sense. She blocks the pawn structure here. One way that to look at this position is that it's a risk-free edge for white. You know, the knight is superior to the bishop. The pawns are weak. Too many issues already in the position. One trump card that black has is the central majority. So if black can get f5 and e4, that would be something. Queen comes to g2, and now the rook goes back. Pawn to b3. I guess one of the ideas Goryachkina can do is rook e4, knight d2, rook c4 and knight e4. Like swiveling around the pieces. Divya goes rook d5. She's waiting. There's nothing much she can do. She cannot push the pawn on f5 because then the e5 pawn would become too weak. So rook goes back to f8. And we have rook e3 played. Bishop comes out to h6, hitting the pawn on e3. And white goes rook e3. Rook e4. Bishop comes back to g7. The queen goes back to g2. It's back and forth a bit. Rook f7. Divya's waiting. She'll happily grab the threefold repetition. I think this is Goryachkina's way of just saying that, okay, I'm happy with what's happening. Let's see what you have got. Rook d4. Pawn comes up to a4. And now the bishop drops back to f8. Well, this is one of the things when you're facing a player like Goryachkina. She's patient. She's going to try to put maximum pressure. There you see now she brings her knight to attack the rook. Divya chops off one of the rook. And now rook takes makes the most sense, not changing the structure in a big way. Queen comes up to d7. Divya is looking at this diagonal here. King g1. And now queen d5 maybe. Yeah, putting the queen on the center. Somehow white has got a bit the coordination wrong. Rook b7 with the idea to come to b4 with the rook. And knight to h2. So the knight will come to f1 to e3 perhaps. Queen d6. And now queen e4. Once again white building up the coordination. Bishop goes back to f8 defending the pawn. Queen e3. Attacking there. And getting the rook to d7, Divya. Maybe f5 is on the cards now. Knight to f3 stops it. Attacking the e5 pawn. And queen up to d5. King h2. Bishop h6. Divya attacks the queen. The queen drops back to e2. Reaching move 40. Gaining another 30 minutes on the clock. Rook d8. And now Goryachkina can simply play knight d2. I think it makes more sense not to trade here. Keeping the bishop keeps this option of defending the pawn alive. And well, bishop d2, although you would like to get rid of the knight, is a mistake. And Divya makes the mistake. She takes it. And all of a sudden Goryachkina is winning because of queen e3 or queen c3. Yes, Divya gets the e4 pawn in. Because now taking here is a mistake. Queen takes e4. But the problem is much deeper than just that. Something like queen e3, queen c3. She even goes queen a5. The issue that we are facing is that after pawn takes pawn, taking the pawn on d3 is a bit dangerous because takes here queen a7 check and then you take, so that would be a bad position. So rook d7 defending here. Queen takes c5. Nice move by Aleksandra. Takes, and we are now into a rook endgame where white is a pawn up. Divya can take on b3, but after rook takes f6 she's losing, so she decides to play f5 and now a check. King h6, and take on a7. Should be winning this endgame, but Goryachkina, being very safe, plays rook b7. a5 by Divya. One way to play for a win now is just to bring your rook here, maybe push the pawn to f4, which is sometimes counterintuitive as that weakens the g3 pawn, but your two pawns will limit the three black pawns. King f1, check. Now king comes up to e2. Divya brings a rook to c3, keeping an eye on the b3 pawn. Such endgames are usually quite complicated to win, but f3 played by Aleksandra, check. And now important to go king e3, because if king d3, we remember the Nakamura versus Esipenko game, you lose these pawns. So king e3, well played by Aleksandra. She's going to f4, maybe later to e5. Check. King f4. And now rook to d3. We have rook coming into b5, wanting to capture the pawn on a5. And rook c3 played. Takes the pawn, rook takes b3. And now rook b5 and a5 is a very good way to play for a win. But she goes rook a8, trying to win in this way. Goryachkina has taken her time, but her position is not losing. But I mean, is not drawing yet. She's winning as white, but somehow the win has become a little bit more complex now. Need to be very careful how you continue. King f6, a good move. King h7. And maybe now king g5 is a nice move, because if you play here, I go check, king back, take, check, king f5. It's difficult to assess if this is winning or not, but it is winning. Rook a7, king h6. Now king f7 played. King goes back. King f8, check. Divya goes back to h8. Have to come back now. This is a mistake, because now rook f3, rook g6 is met with king h7 and king h6, and this is a draw. So rook a6, not a good move. Divya, however, goes wrong with here, but rook a7 needs to be played here. He's thinking hard. Plays king f7. And rook takes pawn. Takes on g6 and f4. Whoa, now it's a draw. It's a draw. Divya has managed to somehow convert this entire game where she was defending for hours and hours into a draw now. Rook takes g3, taken here. Rook takes f4, and now a very simple move. Rook g4, and the game is drawn. Unbelievable defense shown by Divya Deshmukh. She defended with all her might, and she managed to salvage the half point. Of course, have to be careful of rook takes h5, checkmate. So first she takes on h4, a5, and for Aleksandra Goryachkina, this would be quite a sad outcome, because she was really playing well. She really tried her best to grind in the best possible way. But she was not successful, and now the h pawn is running. So it's Goryachkina who should quickly now make a draw here. Rook comes back to b3. Divya takes the pawn with a check. And king g4. The pawn on h3 is falling. h2. and rook check, and this is over. It's interesting to see that both the players are not offering each other a draw. They want to play until bare kings, king g3 check, king g2, and check here, and takes, and it's a draw. A good question to ask is, where could Goryachkina have improved her play? My thinking is that after rook takes a5, rook takes b3, she could have played this move rook b5. I think that kind of wins there, a5, and now let's say king g7. You can even go king g5 here and give up this pawn, when after a check, king f8, you can go a6, a7 and a8. It was easier to keep the rook on b5 instead of going rook a8 here, where the rook was ahead of the pawn, and that gave Divya good drawing chances, although that was also losing. But yeah, great technique there by Goryachkina until a point, and then great defense shown by Divya for the entire game. She never gave up, which means she has now 3 draws in 3 rounds and a good chance to get the lead in the tournament.